Welcome to the study of Thinley Norbu Rinpoche's White Sail. So I'm very happy that all of you have chosen to take time from your schedules to study this. And I'll do my very best to do justice to the subject matter. As I always say, what I intend with these studies is really just that we get together and have a look at this text. So the premise is really that everyone reads the book, and particularly this one requires reading slowly. I'm very happy to sort of together with you participate in, you could say, unpacking or proposing my viewpoint on some of the points that are being made, but above all, it's very much about soaking yourself in Thinley Norbu Rinpoche's teaching, which is quite specific. Rinpoche operates with quite some, you could say, academic rigor, quite some logic, but it's also logic that's founded on introspection, so it's not particularly theoretical. It has a lot to do with being intuitive. And one of Rinpoche's extraordinary skillful means is his language. Somehow Rinpoche has a very particular English, and also use of some of, you could say, the expressions and images sometimes are surprising. He's very much someone who bridges or is comfortable both in Western and Asian discourse. A little bit about Rinpoche. He was a great master, a great incarnation. He was an incarnation of somebody called Tugu Trime, who is a great treasure revealer and also consort of a great woman teacher in the early 20th century, Sarah Kandro. And Tugu Trime was also regarded as an incarnation of Longchen Rabjan, Longchenpa, the omniscient Longchenpa. And so Thinley Norbu Rinpoche was regarded as an incarnation of all of these, as well as he was also the son of Dudjom Rinpoche, his Holiness Dudjom Rinpoche, and received all of his teachings and was really what you could say Dudjom Rinpoche's heart son in terms of holding his Dharma lineage. So, for example, in Bhutan, very much the Dharma lineage of what we call the new treasures of Dudjom Tesa, was initially propagated by Thinley Norbu Rinpoche. And Rinpoche settled in the US, and you could say this book is an outcome from his interaction with our culture. So without further ado then, I'm going to cut the video here so I can I'm going to be reading notes, so I can't really politely look into the video, so you have me excused. So the initial verses here, they touch on the unique opportunity that we presently have with our precious human rebirth. And the next is then praise. Well, first there's some pictures here of Rinpoche, taken in this one here, 1970s, this one too, and this here, I think a bit later, maybe the 1990s. Particularly in Vajrayana, but in Buddhism in general, we pay homage to the principle of enlightenment, generally as embodied in the Buddha. But in the Mahayana, and particularly Vajrayana, we pay homage to the enlightenment as it's embodied in bodhisattvas, and also what we refer to as yidams or deities, which are, you could say, embodiments of the awakened qualities that abide within the ground of all sentient beings. So you could say Buddha nature possesses infinite qualities, and these qualities we represent in terms of body, speech, and mind. And so the body representations are then what we see here, and this is then the point of departure for some very poetic praises that Rinpoche then offers to these various deities. But it's important that we don't think of them as some external gods. We are paying homage to enlightenment, but also enlightenment as it exists within ourselves, within our ground nature. So paying homage to Manjushri is paying homage to the quality of intelligence, which can cut through dullness and ignorance. And notice in there, there's reference to jewel of activity, which is then what Thinley Norbu means. By the way, Thinley Norbu Rinpoche, his name is spelled thinly, but it is actually, we would say, Thinley Norbu. And Saraswati dispels the misery of confusion, then with the soothing tambura of wisdom's joy. And we have here then the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, who is praised for his qualities and activities, and specifically for incarnating in this degenerate age. Padmasambhava is praised as enlightenment manifest and displaying the style of a Vajrayana master. Then there's homage to the great Mother Tara, and also homage to Yeshe Tsogyal, a great Dakini, a great practitioner, and also Padmasambhava's principal student. So each of these homages, they're followed with the words of aspiration, such as, please illuminate the radiant wisdom spirit of my precious Buddha nature. And amaranthine, by the way, means everlasting or unfading in the sense of the faith. So again, this is something where we want to really read this slowly. Tonight is going to be discussions then on the preface, the introduction, and chapter 1, where you could say the preface is very much humbly identifying our limitations in terms of our cultural outlook and some of the, you could say, the discourse and the belief systems that are pervasive in modernity. I wouldn't say Western modernity, but universal modernity. And this is very much the belief system of what we could call scientific materialism, but as Thinley Norbu Rinpoche would say more precisely identifies it, nihilism. In the introduction, then we'll look at the potential scope of this study, namely the innate purity of the mind. And then in chapter 1, we'll look at the different approaches to understanding or explaining mind. In some cases, explaining it away, and then some the various Buddhist ways of realizing the mind. So with the opening verses from Paltra Rinpoche, Paltra Rinpoche highlights then how simple words can convey the very heart of enlightenment. And the very heart of the objective of enlightenment is then to transform the deception or remove the deception of delusion. So that's the core of all paths, awakening. Specifically, Rinpoche had a very close American student, actually a couple, Roger and Sybil Weil, and he writes here how this book is a response to Roger's request on how to transform the deception of these nihilist beliefs into the pure undeceived phenomena of kayas and wisdoms. Specifically then talking about, you could say, the limited, tangible, finite deception of nihilist delusion, and how he would like to have some teachings on how to transform it into the, as Rinpoche says, vast, intangible, infinite appearances of enlightenment. So this is really what lies at the heart of the teaching. As you'll see here, Rinpoche is he's not being polemical or wishing to polarize, but there will in this book, and there is a lot of, you could say, refutation and challenging of some of the assumptions that we live by. And so this critical discussion is not written to insult, but it's rather to expose some dogmatic assumptions that lead to suffering. You could say some fixations or bad ideas that get in the way of us leading a what you could say, a good life, but also particularly in the way of awakening the natural disposition or potential of the mind. And so the critique that we find in here of this nihilism, it's really intended to empower and liberate, to give us a sense of what we can do, and particularly also point to the path of actually doing it. And with that, it's obvious that we're not talking about just some theorizing, but we're very much coming from a point of view that this is a living tradition. And there is countless individuals who has actually awakened. And so in that sense, the scope of this is not at all theoretical. But then again, we are surrounded by a lot of theories. And again, quoting Paltra Rinpoche, it says, hundreds of ordinary and sublime beings from ancient times have left their theories in the world. But in the minds of children, contradiction always increases instead of benefit. So for anyone who leaves new theories, it will be the same. So this again is more to speak on the fact that as much as we have intellectualization and that we have all the various kinds of academic projects and theories, hypotheses, and so forth, these are really just intellectual positions, and that very often end up standing in opposition to one another. Until then, both oppositions or positions, they're invalidated when a third position emerges. If we look at the history of Western thought throughout 2,000 or more years, this is very much the case. In the case of Buddhism, the Buddha's discovery of enlightenment is not something that was later replaced. It's rather something that was continually confirmed as valid. So there's a big difference between philosophizing and then actual experience. So in that sense, the propositions that we're making here are very much based on experience. Now, in approaching Buddhism, it's not easily understood. And we have two extremes that you can say that we might recognize. One is how rejection of tradition, or rather we have rejection of tradition, very much later 20th century phenomenon in the West. And then we have rigid adherence to tradition, very often found in traditional societies, not least Buddhist societies. And both of these, you could say, approaches, they can get in the way of understanding Buddhism. The former simply operates from the point of view that there's nothing that really can be understood, and Buddhism as a path is something that doesn't make sense because there's nowhere to go. That's very often the modern or postmodern idea, that there's not really any meaning or direction, and hence what should we do with the path? Except maybe sometimes we could use it as sort of a nice way to kill time. And so that's one, you could say, way or approach that gets in the way of understanding Buddhism. And even though we here who are attending this webinar, this might not apply, it's something that we probably see around us. And then Buddhism can also be missed through attachment to tradition, where the fascination or the objective is more the vehicle, and there's not really a sense of going anywhere. So this is where we very often have the traditional cultures where Buddhism is objectified as part of some cultural identity. So you could say the former falls into the nihilist camp and the latter falls into the eternalist camp. And yeah, so with the first camp, then there's not really any sense of faith in something that's sublime, and in the others, it's like there are sublime beings, but gosh, I could never ever be a sublime person myself. So these get in the way. So so this is where we'd want to approach this. In general, we talk about 4 ways that we should see the Dharma. We should see the Buddha as a physician or a doctor. We should see ourselves as a patient. We should see the Dharma as the remedy or the medicine, and then the path as the cure. So this is where we get over these kind of alienated approaches. So, as we established before, Dharma is not intended to polemicize, or it's not a threat to any belief about reality. It's not really a belief. It's not really based on blind faith or metaphysics. It's very much what the Buddha discovered. That's the idea of enlightenment. So this is seeing clearly. Of course, very often we just don't want to look. And so that's something that is very often part of our culture. When it's something that's unknown, nobody really wants to look. There's some sense that fear that we might lose our identity, we might lose our rigid or habitual beliefs. Now this work here that we're looking at, it operates very much with outlining a limited belief of nihilism, and nihilism in the sense of asserting only what is tangible. And opposed to that is then the intangible qualities of wisdom. And you could say wisdom is something that permeates both the tangible and the intangible. And so in approaching this, we need to follow our own logic. We need to, when we're hearing this, we also need to compare it to our own experience. And this leads us then from fixation on something material or something that we can objectify just as knowledge into understanding something that's beyond just knowledge or what can be objectified and address experience. Thinley Norbu is very much a yogi, so the flavor of this text is very much permeated by this yogic perspective. So the introduction then is more about the big picture, about unobscured reality, how it's not constructed through thoughts. And this then begins with the quote that we have from the Buddha, where he says, famously from, I think, the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, it says, I show you the path of liberation. Whether you attain liberation is up to you. Bluntly as that. And the implication here is that we have the what it takes. We have the ground. Our consciousness is primordially free from the confused constructions of subject and object. Not recognizing, however, this reality, we project realms based on our karma and habitual patterns. And this is what we then call samsara, the 6 realms of samsara, which are created through such projection. So that means, and this is where Rinpoche then describes the various realms. The hell realm is a projection of hatred. The hungry ghost realm is a projection of a sense of poverty and greed and so forth. But when we approach the Buddhist path, we do so with a tremendous appreciation of the potential of our mind, and understanding that mind in itself is not stained, is never conditioned by this confusion, and in its ground it's free of the painful constructions of subject and object. So when we say subject and object, it's a sense of I, me, and then the objects is what we're always attentive to, either getting what we want or not getting what we want. And in that way we continually live with this sense of me and my objects, or me and the other. And this creates then the cycle of samsara. In this, you could say, in this, however much samsara plays out, at the ground of it, there is a purity. And what we can say is our projection comes from a delusion where we just don't understand mind. And we, you could say, pervert the manifestations of the mind. So in the pure nature, all of these, you could say, capacity for manifesting, the manifest as brilliant display, what we call wisdom display. And in such a nature, then there's not that split between self and other. This is not something that we fabricate. This non-duality is not something we attain. You could say the duality of self and other is a delusion that we have created, but in the ground there is no such sense, no such construction as subject and object. Rinpoche quotes then the omniscient Longchenpa, who says, self-arising awareness, the absolute sun, is obscured by both white and black clouds of virtue and non-virtue. The effort of attachment to acceptance and rejection is a turbulent lightning storm. The rainfall of delusions, happiness, and suffering continually descends. Samsara's seed produces the abundantly growing crops of the six realms. Alas, all tormented sentient beings are pitiful. So you could say the intrinsic reality of our mind is this self-arising awareness, but it's obscured by this duality, and from that then we continually operate with the causes that create happiness, which is some virtue, and the causes that create suffering, which is non-virtue. And continually we are thrown about because of our this acceptance and rejection, meaning there are things we like and things we don't like. And as a consequence, we consolidate this delusional sense of self, and it becomes more and more solid. And as a result, then, we perpetuate these patterns. The result is then the various experiences of samsara, sometimes happiness, sometimes suffering. And as we go through different experiences, we have then these six realms. So Longchenpa expresses compassion for this condition. Now, if we look in the human realm, then we have these two things that we very often end up with, is that we believe in something, or we believe then we no longer believe in something. For example, somebody we trust, and we lend them money, and then they don't pay back, then all of a sudden we don't trust them anymore. And actually the person is beyond really trust and not trust. It's the idea that we attribute trustworthy is an exaggeration, and then when we attribute untrustworthy is also an exaggeration. And the beliefs of nihilism and eternalism very much, you could say, strategies with which we narrow, or it comes from our insecurity, but it narrows our experience. And it's very much something that's founded on this insecure sense of ego. And eternalism, as many will know, is this idea. Rinpoche refers to it as an optimistic view of believing in some greater creative force. The nihilist view is that there's nothing beyond the tangible. It's more pessimistic. And so these two views are both conceptual ideas. And there's a famous quote, there's a famous point in one of the sutras where the Buddha is asked to commit to some truths about the universe, about this and that. And it's all philosophy, and that's where the Buddha doesn't answer 14 questions. He just keeps silence, because there's no point. These are just concepts, and it doesn't really have anything doesn't really help in any way. And so this establishing an understanding that goes beyond these limited beliefs we have then particularly introduced through the Madhyamika teaching, where we understand then reality and its non-abiding nature. We can say that our reality is empty of anything that can be grasped by beliefs. If you look at the two gentlemen there, they're both believing that they're right, and they can somewhat, you could say, they're both right actually. And this is what we call relative truth. And so the moment that they would know that there's not an inherent truth to what they're seeing, then they would actually be in agreement. They would say, you see a 9 and I see a 6. There wouldn't really be any rigid position of how things are, but rather an understanding of the conditions that lead to relative perceptions. And as simple as this might sound, this is very much what rules the whole mechanism around our ego and our sense of rigid adopting belief systems. And this also consolidates the alienation between us and the others, and is at the, you could say, at the core of all conflict. So understanding this is not just a trivial spiritual little precious project, but it's essential really, and we do operate it with it when we understand each other. Parents understand their children. We understand persons who might not have a understanding that we're privy to, and so forth. But the thing is, once we understand that there is no ultimate reality, this is not some void. This is where we actually begin to see more. And actually, if we look at the two gentlemen, where they look upset right now, the moment they would understand, then there would be qualities that would emerge, such as sympathy and not setting up barriers. You can see there's barriers between these two gentlemen. So once we understand emptiness, this actually enables us to free up limitless qualities. And Rinpoche here then describes the qualities of enlightened body, speech, and mind, again, very poetically in terms of how they manifest. So this is very much how Rinpoche writes, actually. He very often has these very beautiful and poetical sort of, there's not even poetry, it's like you could say paragraphs. So I'll just check if there's any questions. Yeah. Okay. I hope everybody's seeing okay and hearing okay. I hope the sound is all right. I actually skipped the sound check this time. I'm asking for many years. So far, it's actually never been a problem. So good, and you can also see the PowerPoint, hopefully. Good. All right. There's not any questions about the subject matter? Not so far? Okay, good. Anyway, you can always, we'll have a Q&A later also. Oh. Sorry. Voila. Chapter 1, different thoughts. So we, again, I think open with Rinpoche's, some of Rinpoche's poetry, again. As we can see here, then when we talk about not seeing something, there we very often have a sense that, well, if I can't see it, it's not there. This of course, we associate it with a limitation. We see that as narrow-minded, but it is something that very much permeates the subject matter that we're touching on here, which is spiritual path and enlightenment. So in that no one really has in our culture, it's not really something that's that common. Rinpoche is speaking here after many years of being very close with Westerners and familiar with the view on spirituality. So he's not really coming as someone who's just going to teach Buddhism, but very much as someone who's relating to our belief system and teaching with an awareness of these systems. And nihilism then is this only accepting what we presently perceive. So it makes for a very narrow view of our reality. It is disempowering, leaving us vulnerable to circumstances then, as in the example gives with a prostitute who is dependent on her rather unreliable clientele. We might accept there is consciousness as the experiences that emerge on the basis of perception of the senses. That's general how we would say science and neuroscience, they would define consciousness as basically what we are experiencing. But in terms of if that is all there's to our mind, then that leaves us very disempowered, actually as victims of these perceptions. And it overlooks something, an intelligence, which is, you could say, the intangible source of the mind. There is something continuous, something that's not created. And that unborn quality of consciousness or innate intelligence is then what Rinpoche refers to as continuous mind. It corresponds to what we call alaya vijnana, or alaya, the all ground, or storehouse consciousness. So all what we call past memories, future plan, they all take place within such a continuous mind. This mind is not enlightened mind, but it's just really what keeps us in samsara. That's you could say that's the ground of our delusion. So such a mind then is not bound by fragmented moments of consciousness, and it's also not something that's created by biological processes. This is a biggie, but it's something that we need to take it by the horns. So it's tempting that we then, we could deny this dimension of innate freedom, and it is, you could say, it's just not known in our science. And we might be very committed then to this viewpoint, this rather dogmatic materialist viewpoint. But if we look, our consciousness is the most immediate we have. And if we look, we can see for ourselves how everything that we perceive comes through a consciousness. And we can see how it's more than just these perceptions, that there is an undiluted awareness. From a Buddhist point of view, then, to choose to deny this wisdom is something that leads to really obscuring and shielding us from our biggest natural asset or potential. That's what you could say the Buddhist path is all about. It's this unclouded sanity, and we experience it. And the paradox is that despite the rationality that we in the modern world profess to subscribe to, we in fact use intangible experience, let's say love or hate, to establish corresponding solid, tangible realities, such as then our good or bad relationships. But to deny our potential for subtle wisdom it cuts us off from using tangible phenomena, all our perceptions, such as then unvirtuous actions of body, speech, and mind, that we could actually use these tangible phenomena to uncover and connect with intangible wisdom. So you better get used to this way of, you could say, juxtaposing things as Rinpoche does here. But we're essentially talking about the ground of the mind, which is intangible, and yet we have manifestation that we could make work for us. And that's where we're going much further than just speaking of mind in terms of consciousness, just as a reaction to perceptions. So what we're saying here is that our mind is more than thoughts and memories. Its ground is ordinary continuous mind, the obscured all ground, or alaya vijnana. This, by the way, is what creates samsara. And it is nothing, you could say, sublime. It's deluded conditions. We're hallucinating the six realms. But it is, for the time being, that which continually creates all our perceptions. And this is something that is not tangible. And this is what continues beyond our ordinary life. So we might accept we have a consciousness, but then we identify this this mind as merely a product of past thoughts or fragmented occurrences, and then thoughts about the future. And this gives us some sense of continuity. And this everyone shares. But to merely define mind as that would lead us to think of the mind as something that is entirely contingent on what is perceived, without any life of its own, without any cognitive capacity external to these perceptions, and hence without potential for freedom. So we can see how we actually have awareness that strategizes based on our memory, understanding what brought happiness, what brought suffering, and so forth. And we could say our mind is much more than just a lifeless canvas that accepts all these imprints. So we think it's thoughts, memories that create mind, but these are just fragments. And the ground of this is this alaya vijnana, or continuous mind. So we might say that we only accept what can be established and proven empirically, but that's actually not true, because we believe in what we think, and that's perhaps our detriment, but it very often constructs our subjective experience, however illogical it might be. And so fixating on thoughts, we are not really properly relating to them, and we overlook their actual nature. And as a consequence, we miss this great potential of natural awareness. So, as Thinley Norbu says, even though enlightenment can be attained through practice, if we do not believe in practice because we do not accept continuous mind, we're automatically prevented from using our actually uninterrupted connection to continuous mind and our potential to increase inexhaustible, pure spiritual power by transforming this continuity into its pure essence. So at the ground of this continuous mind, we find pure essence or wisdom. But it's through working through and working with this mind that we uncover this wisdom essence, Buddha nature. So in addition to disbelieving in the continuous mind, there is the nihilist belief intrinsic to what we loosely call modern science, that mind is produced by randomly occurring biological processes. So that is, you could say, the nihilist view. So from that point of view, it's just consciousness is just a random occurrence, an emergent property of some external causes, and this ceases at the time of physical death. So that's a very persistent belief, accepted high and low in our society. And yet, the thing is, contemporary science actually concedes that consciousness is the hard problem. So I think everybody is familiar with this this view. This is what we are surrounded by. But it's as if it's something where we think that consciousness is, the image that very often is used is consciousness is like steam. So you have the conditions of water and some heat, and then consciousness arises as an emergent property from two things that actually are unrelated to it. So in that sense, there's not really a proper, you could say, consciousness is seen as something that ultimately is physical. It's created by material conditions. And as such, it ends at the time of death. And that's how most of us actually have been brought up to believe that. And we think that there's a solid science behind it, but there's not really. And it is very much an area where there's a humble consensus that is not understood. And it is what then scientists, particularly David Chalmers, who's an Australian philosopher and neuroscientist, he in the 1990s, he coined this the hard problem of science. So in that sense, you would think that persons in modernity, they would say, well, we have some fantastic technology, but we don't really understand this consciousness. See, that would be, you could say, fair saying that, but unfortunately that's not the case. And as a result, then there's some pretty categorical assumptions that are being made. Alan Wallace, who's a great scholar, meditator, and holds has studied neuroscience at Stanford and also has a PhD in comparative religion and so forth, who's written a lot on this, including a work that's called The Taboo of Subjectivity. And in there he writes, mainstream neuroscience insists that individual consciousness vanishes with the death of the body. However, given its ignorance of the origins and nature of consciousness and its inability to detect the presence or absence of consciousness in any organism, living or dead, neuroscience does not seem to be in a position to back up that conviction with empirical scientific evidence. So there we have it from someone who then can formulate that from within. But this is essentially what we're talking about here in terms of this idea of nihilism. Eternalism, on the other hand, then, accepts some belief in continuous mind, but as something that's created by something external, a God, a creator God, and promising then eternal salvation for those with faith in these gods. Or we will also associate eternalism with just the belief in something absolute, something substantial as eternal or unchanging, some principle. And now you could say with the view of eternalism, then there is very much a sense that there is a path, that there's something that if we're servants of God or invoking the mercy of a greater power, then there's very much an ethical perspective where we believe in cause and effect and also consequences beyond death, that consciousness continues beyond death. So at the end of the day, that view is something that creates for much more happiness, not just in the hereafter, but also in the present. The old Indians, and this is not particularly PC, I often quote this, but it's really an important thing that sums these two up. And I think it's Saraha who maybe said it. I did find the Tibetan once, but in effect, it says something like, to believe in something is to be dumb as cattle, but to believe in nothing is to be even dumber. So we very often, I think, find ourselves, you could say, in the crossroads between these two camps. So while they both are operating within really some very conceptual frameworks and not really, you could say, experiencing awake reality, then there's one that is the foundation for more happiness, and that is eternalism. And very often associated with, then again, what we call religions. So then we come to the Buddhist views. So the Buddhist view about conventional experience is that all phenomena originates in the obscured continuous mind. And that's where we essentially just have perceptions. Nothing has ever actually taken place. But we, just like in a dream, we are experiencing something as seeming very real. And that is the product, the manifestation of this deluded mind or obscured continuous mind. In Tibetan, semki gyu. Now, what the Buddha discovered is that this obscured continuous mind veils something, and if we could break through that, then we discover non-dualistic wisdom mind. And this we experience then when the obscurations are purified. Nyugme yeshe. So that's common to all the Buddhist paths, that the mind is workable. There's some confusion, but there's something we can do about it, and in doing something about it, then we unveil something that we never knew before, something that's intrinsic to us. Now, when we say Hinayana, this is of course a Mahayana expression, and it's not necessarily associated with some particular existing traditions, but it's very much a way of identifying the Mahayana. So there is the sense that in the Hinayana, and you could say the foundational vehicles, that which you could say when we begin the path, this is where we normally start. And that is then recognizing this ground that is, we have an afflicted mind, and we then operate with meditation on the path of calm abiding, meditating, and through that discovering a wider perspective, vipassana, and the discovery of no self. So we would say then the practitioners of the Hinayana, they remedy then the afflictions in this way through the path, and they achieve the peace of cessation, and they settle in the continuity of mind that is non-afflicted. But this is not enlightenment. And so just settling in sensation in which there's a non-afflicted condition of the continuity of mind is sometimes misunderstood for nirvana. But this is what the Mahayanas particularly point out. This is merely a cessation. And then we go on to the Mahayana, where there's two schools. There's the Yogacarya, which operates with an understanding of all phenomena as creations of the mind, and this ground, or this we refer to as the dependent nature, and that it can be, depending on the conditions, it can either be obscured or it can be awakened. But that ground is regarded as something solid, and or rather, some Yogacaryas regard it as solid, and some maybe not that solid, but that's another discussion. But the path then is purifying the basis of mind of the impurities, which is essentially purifying the mind of the confusion, what we call the imagined nature. And this leads to unveiling the stainless ground of the mind, which is the perfect nature. So that's pretty much what we call the three natures as the Yogacarya understand mind, in terms of its three moments, you could say, in confusion and on the path and in awakening. In the Madhyamika, and this is the ultimate view according to pretty much the Mahayana traditions, the ground there is to understand that mind's basis is something that's not an object of intellect, and that the various constructions that we have, they are in reality unfounded. What we call samsara nirvana, confusion and lack thereof, is intangible and doesn't really exist in any solid way. So that ground is something that cannot be described or objectified or thought in any way. And this is what we call the Dhammadhatu, this space of reality. And the path then, understanding that, and this is what we do when we, for example, study Madhyamika, it's to dismantle all conceptual constructions. So when we have an understanding of how confusion happens and how the nature itself is untouched by confusion, and understand, we have some idea of this nature of reality, then the path is doing something about it, eliminating obscurations and the habitual phenomena, eliminating these obscurations of habitual phenomena. And we do that by means of the two accumulations. The one accumulation of merit relates to our conventional reality, and the other, the tangible, and the other, the accumulation of wisdom, is about the intangible, wisdom itself. And in applying this path of eliminating obscurations and unveiling realization, then the result is then the realization of enlightenment, what we call stainless Dhammakaya, which completely realizes then this ground, the inexpressible space of reality. So these constitute so far what we call the causal vehicle. Then we have the resultant vehicle that takes the perspective of the abiding nature as the path itself. And that is where we understand our ground nature is inexpressible. Yes, it possesses qualities, and in that it can't be objectified or held in any way. It is nevertheless something that is experienced on a subjective level. So objectively we establish emptiness, but subjectively there's a wisdom that recognizes this. And that ground nature of wisdom, or Buddha nature, in the Vajrayana we bring onto the path as deity. And as you will see here, Thinley Norbu operates a lot with this sense of deity. The path is then integrating continually all these experiences that we have, all our perceptions, with the understanding that whatever we perceive intrinsically is free from our projections and confusions and exists as intrinsic purity. We integrate that view. And this we then do through various means, what we call development stage practice, completion stage practice, stages of visualization, stages of yoga, and various methods. But these are all ways of integrating this understanding. And with that, we unveil the original ground, which is beyond this continuous mind and its wisdom and wisdom display. So this is we're going to be touching more on that. So if that sounds a bit overwhelming, don't be intimidated in any way. But if you're a practitioner of Vajrayana, then sometimes when you have a pithy summary like you have it here in the case of Rinpoche in his teachings, really sort of reaffirms the brilliance of this this vehicle. Continuous mind is integrated as wisdom, bringing end to delusion, awakening innate wisdom. What is remedied is non-recognition of wisdom. This is what we eliminate. Yet, non-recognition is mere conceptions with its patterns. So we shouldn't overestimate this non-recognition. This thing that needs to be remedied is not an overwhelming or impossible problem. So in the Vajrayana path then, when we talk about this continuous mind, we recognize that its intrinsic nature is wisdom, and that's where we then think in terms of deity, our Buddha nature as deity, and the path of sadhana and so forth. So when we're visualizing deity, we're using continuous mind, but actually using continuous mind to go beyond itself and to realize the place where there's no delusion. So this is where you could say continuous mind dissolves into wisdom. But as long as there is this non-recognition or exclusion of the innate wisdom, then confusion, the habits thereof, karma, and so on, this keeps going on. Just like daytime experiences, they inform our dreams, and later on then in the night we have these experiences based on what happened during the day. So likewise also throughout lifetimes we have this confusion and the habits that perpetuate the various experiences we have, as per our last study on karma. And it's only when we see through this, like when we wake up from a dream, that we discover wisdom. So we cannot just abandon this continuous ordinary mind. We have no choice in addressing this confusion. But when we do that, we uncover this underlying wisdom. So Rinpoche, he says here, even if we accept that mind is continuous, and this, by the way, very often we find when people say, oh, I'd like to believe in reincarnation, that sounds like a nice idea, or stuff like that. That's just believing that mind is continuous is a comforting idea. Is not really the case. It's this continuous mind is the cause of continual suffering. So dealing with this mind and accepting rebirth is not really a comforting thought. It's just we have to do that. But if we just accept that there's this continual mind, rebirth after rebirth after rebirth, that's not that great. I mean, we might think that something wonderful awaits us, but there's not really that in Buddhism. We actually are not destined, or there's not this deterministic view that something sort of things are going to get better and better. That there's no, you could say, empirical evidence for that if we look at our own life. So Rinpoche says, sorry, that was my commentary. Anyway, Rinpoche says, even if we accept that mind is continuous, if we do not realize unending wisdom mind, it only becomes the basis of habit which causes the circling suffering of samsara. Ordinary continuous mind does not cause anything ultimately positive, but since it is continuous, it cannot be abandoned. Since it cannot be abandoned, if we wish for the cessation of all worldly conception, our only choice is to transform it through meditation into unending stainless wisdom mind, which means completely untarnished enlightenment. So this continuous mind that creates our conceptions is not an end in itself, but we need to deal with it. And this is the ground that, when purified, unveils Dharmakaya. We also say that this ordinary continuous mind is like the night sky. And when it's not obscured anymore, then the luminous sky that's permeated by sunlight, this is the Dharmakaya. So it's the same space, but it's either veiled or not. So we recognize that this continuous mind is only there as a delusion, sustained by these dualistic concepts. And Rinpoche quotes Dignaga, Chogi Langbo, where he says, except for conception, there is not even the name of samsara. Whenever you are free from that conception, you are always in enlightenment. So increasing qualities of continuous mind, deluded conceptions clear. Ordinary perceptions are transformed into pure perception. This path is not constructed by intellectual positions, it is free from fabrication. What is revealed was always there, like a hidden treasure. Let me just at this point, by the way, say that, and I wrote this also in the mail you have received, there will inevitably be, or not always, but there will be times when we go over time. So I try to do this in an hour, but it might also go a bit longer. But I would think that it's rarely going to be more than 10 or maximum 20 minutes. So what we then do with increasing the pure qualities of the ordinary mind eliminates delusion. So the mind appears to transform from this ordinary continuous mind into wisdom, with ordinary perceptions seen as they are, free from habit, and they appear to transform into pure perception. So note here, this is what we're talking about here is an organic development as there's less delusion. But we also do in Vajrayana employ this visualization of the nature of mind or nature of wisdom through visualization of deity as a way of recognizing intrinsic purity, both on a subjective side and also in terms of our objective perceptions. So we recognize that this is, you could say, a more realistic way of understanding our reality, but it doesn't mean that we right away see it with our habitual mind. So we can't look up and say, we can't go in the mirror and say, I don't look like a deity. We can't look out and say, this certainly doesn't look like a mandala. Wisdom and pure perception is not an object of the ordinary intellect. So it's not also burdened by all these contradictions and conceptual positionings. So in the middle way, this is called freedom from conceptual constructs, or what Thinley Norbu refers to as freedom from fabrication. In the Nyingma, this is called primordial purity of inconceivable great emptiness. And this nature is always present, but we overlook it. And like a treasure buried under a poor person's house, we suffer despite we have this innate wealth that's spontaneously there. So until awakening, it's essential that we use this ordinary continuous mind and its conceptions as the path. And all the various vehicles that we have, they use our, you could say, phenomena as the path. And we can't, and what we do is actually make use of our phenomena. So it's just like if we have water in the ears, we can wash it out by putting in some more water. So the particular view here, which we have in the Nyingma Tantras, is not all that different from what we have in the Tantras of the New Translation. But it's just there's sometimes different ways that we would, you could say, link up the understanding of the Vajrayana with in relation to the sutra vehicles. Anyway, the view here is that we have a ground of reality. This is called the primordial ground, and this, you could say, is the original space. Now, what happens then? There's nothing tangible about that, but then we have phenomena manifesting, and when this manifestation occurs, if we're not deluded and we at the same time recognize this is we recognize our primordial ground, we're Buddhas. Just like if we're in a dream and we know it's just a dream, then we're not caught by it. However, if we're not recognizing this ground, then we wander as sentient beings. So this is where basically where we refer to this as deluded or undeluded. So there's various ways of describing this. In the Dzogchen Tantras, they talk about 8 doors of manifestation, and these are essentially, we could sum them up in 2 ways. Rinpoche refers to as the 2 entrances, which are 1, non-recognition, which is then what defines us then as sentient beings, and then the habits that follow, which is then samsara and all the karmic patterns. So we can say that all phenomena arise within this non-dual space of reality itself, and this is the universal ground we call the Buddha Samantabhadra. Now here, phenomena are known to be wisdom display. So the Buddha Samantabhadra experiences perceptions, but is never deluded, and so there's not any kind of delusion taking place, just like someone who knows it's a dream. But not recognizing this, persons like myself, I think I and my perceived object, and I cling to this duality, that then arises then the confusion of a sentient being, the emerging of the kleshas, the various states of afflicted mind, and all the actions that emerge from that, karma, and from that then habitual patterns that then manifest as the 6 realms of samsara. Now, when we're a sentient being, we have 2 kinds of experience, really. We know that we each have, like the 2 men who stood there and they looked at the 6 or the 9, right? They each insist on that. But we would also say, hey, they are looking at something that's common phenomena. And so these 2 perceptions then is something that we continually sort of operate with, and what we operate with in dealings with others is continually establishing consensus. And once we then establish some consensus, this becomes part of our private experience then also, as Rinpoche describes. But you could say Buddha nature is where our sanity continually manifests to clarify such confusion. We might think that we're stuck in being how we are, but Buddha nature is continually manifesting as to teach us, you could say, both inside and also literally outside. We would regard the external teachers that appear in our world as not being just, you could say, ordinary phenomena. They're beyond these private or common phenomena of consensus. This is something that lies beyond that. And so we would say such phenomena are different from Confucian's dualism, and it's the skillful means that manifest as Buddha nature that enables us to then integrate phenomena as the path. So with the practicing of the path then, we're joining mind's pure reflection to the self-originating mandala of enlightened beings, which always increases wisdom qualities. So this is very typical of Rinpoche's language, taking English and sort of saying things that you wouldn't think would be possible to say. The bottom line is that we need to be discerning about what brings suffering and what brings happiness. So this is as simple as it gets, but it's also a simplicity that we often overlook. And when we sort of wonder, what should I do? Then if we recall the Buddha, think of the teachers, like we just talked about before, the Buddha nature manifesting externally. This is something that remedies destructive patterns and brings awakening. We sometimes, what is it they say, what would Jesus do? And in the Buddhist tradition, we actually have what's called Buddha Anusmriti, or that's in general, and particularly in the Vajrayana, very much the calling the teacher, or the notion of the teacher being present within our lives. And that's very often where we needn't actually fall into these habitual patterns. And while we're in the middle of doing whatever we're doing, we could actually experience awakening. So Rinpoche says that if we want to be free from deluded personal and general phenomena, it requires that we have some oh, sorry, that's the next one. Yeah, let's just go on to the next one. So to be free, we discontinue, and that's what we do with the practice of meditation. We discontinue the delusion of ignoring reality. So both in meditation and post-meditation, we introduce this wider perspective in terms of being present, cultivating vipassana, and also in post-meditation, we stop this ordinary deluded practice of just focusing on self, and rather we embrace the world around with compassion. So in that way, we put an end to delusion. And what we're doing continually is not building up a new dogma, but rather freedom. And that, what we would call then, is facing reality, and that is the practice of Dharma. However, to do that, if we want to be free from this deluded personal and also general phenomena, it requires that we have some external, initially have some external source of refuge, an external reality, which is then the triple gem, the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And invoking this principle, then we gradually understand how the triple gem is something that exists within. Rinpoche says specifically in a Vajrayana context, then this enables us to see our phenomena as wisdom deity. Rinpoche concludes the chapter then with saying, in order to release our mind from the habit of heavy general phenomena, excuse me, in order to release our mind from the habit of heavy general phenomena, we must try to develop and increase the habit of the light personal phenomena of wisdom deity, until the habit of all general and personal phenomena has been completely exhausted into the habitless, naked ease of naturally manifesting deity and the clear wisdom sky space. So in that sense, the Rinpoche is continually, you could say, touching on an intuitive dimension that appreciates this, but also backing it up with, you could say, logic and so forth. So we have here in this text a logical, you could say, substantiation or argumentation for this view of wisdom, understanding how it lies at the core of our, or rather it lies beyond this ordinary continuous mind of confusion, and understanding how we are sort of veiled in terms of our eternalistic habits or nihilistic habits. And this project of dismantling this confusion is then to enable unconditional ground nature of our Buddha nature to manifest, which is then referred to as wisdom deity. So let's see if there's any questions. Okay, all right. Also, there will be some who listen to this when it's not real time, who listen to the recording, and you are, and everybody, of course, is welcome to send me questions if there's anything that's not clear. So I guess that's it then for today. And for the next time, please read then Chapter 2, The Source of Phenomena, and Chapter 3, Simple Logic. Thank you very much. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Thank you.